I'm going to go ahead and start now. So let me introduce myself. My name is Calvert Jones, and okay, great. I just saw somebody say awesome, thanks. So I think everyone is here. Anyway, I was just introducing myself, and I'm sorry for the delay. I had a few technical challenges here on my side. But my name is Calvert Jones. I am an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. I focus on comparative politics with an emphasis on the Middle East region. So today I'm going to be presenting the results of some studies that I conducted in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And the title of the presentation is Accelerating Social Change in the Gulf, Experiments on Gender Mixing. And please let me know in the chat if you can't see something or something isn't going quite right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about that issue, accelerating social change in the Gulf countries, with a focus on the opportunities and pitfalls of changing gender dynamics. And in my presentation, I'm going to show you research that I conducted on how people behave in newly mixed gender environments based on fieldwork I did and also experiments that I conducted in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So first, some background on the issue of gender mixing. Gender mixing is a term from Arabic. It's not that typical in English, and it refers to men and women interacting freely with one another, particularly in public spaces like public schools, the workplace, cafes, stores, government offices, and so on. It is an issue that can be very sensitive in the region. It's especially sensitive in the more socially conservative Gulf societies. Norms of gender segregation are contested, but still operative to some extent and constraining, both informally, but also in some cases formally. For example, with a few exceptions, public schools, K through 12, tend to be gender segregated by law throughout the region. So you mostly see boys' schools and girls' schools, not co-ed, and you do see some inequalities there. Recent research in political science has also highlighted the implications for economic and political development. For example, Barnett, Jamal, and Monroe found that mixed gender workspaces actually weakened women's desire to engage in paid labor in a study that was conducted in Jordan. And in a study conducted in Egypt, Bush and Prather found that both men and women, when primed to think of a mixed gender group of office holders, were less inclined to want to contact their representatives. Let me show you some visual examples from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. First, in Saudi Arabia, for decades, it has been typical to observe physical boundaries set up at cashiers, as you see here at the McDonald's, the Burger King, and also separate entrances or lines at the airport, or even signs placed on doors. Now, interestingly, given recent policy changes in Saudi Arabia, the state was the one that did the most to institutionalize and legitimize these practices. In the public school system, for example, the schools built were initially mostly for boys, and when it was proposed that girls should also be in school, there was considerable backlash from more conservative elements in society. And so segregation was actually seen as quite liberal at the time. It was proposed as a compromise, a way of protecting women. Girls could go to school too, but in separate schools where they would be safe and protected. So this was followed up with the 1969 labor law, stating that in no case may men and women mix in places of work or in accessory facilities or in any other place. As we know, much of this has been reversed by the current regime in recent years, but change does take time. Now, in Kuwait, the history has been quite different. The country was experiencing liberal social trends in the 1960s, around the same time that the Saudis were introducing segregation into their evolving public school system. Yet by the 1990s, an Islamist-leaning parliament proposed banning mixing of the sexes in classes, libraries, labs, and activities in Kuwait University. And after that, most universities, including many private ones, were officially segregated, even if the implementation on the ground was very uneven and also very controversial, and continues to be quite contested. These are pictures I took during fieldwork in Kuwait. Arab Open University, for example, is private and has a men's side of the campus and a women's side, including separate and actually color-coded blue and pink underground parking garages. So public debate can be quite polarizing and brings up several points. So on the one hand, advocates of some level of separation or segregation, particularly some very conservative clerics who have been influential historically, argue that it is essential to safeguarding the moral fabric of society and that greater gender mixing would lead to negative outcomes, immorality, corruption, bad behavior, and to cite much religious principles or call separation an intrinsic part of national or Arab or Muslim culture. Now, opponents argue quite the opposite, that segregation is not rooted in religion or culture, and that it is an obstacle to a healthy public sphere, that it violates human rights norms and can have some significant economic costs, including low labor market participation, their increasingly higher education. In my own field work, I found that strong an end to gender segregation in college classes, for example. Many students were very full of it, imagine. One argument echoes broader research on the contact hypothesis, suggesting that mixed gender interactions would lead to less objectification and greater humanistic cooperation. Argument was about how separation may influence open-minded in the world. One of the most interesting things an interviewee said to me was, listen, if you're unable to accept someone of the opposite sex, I trust you to be open-minded when analyzing a blood test. But one point I do want to underscore from my fieldwork was that even many liberal supporters of gender mixing, people who were advocates of really relaxing, if not eliminating segregation norms, even they were somewhat cynical about what would actually happen in newly mixed gender environments. In fact, a number of them told me that even though they oppose segregation on principle, they weren't sure that their own relatively conservative societies were ready for the degree of gender mixing that you see in, say, Western countries. They suspected that men would behave mixed gender interactions, that sexist remarks would belittle women's contributions, would just sort of behave badly. And so ironically, even these critics of segregation were saying that in the short term, they would rather advocate for more women-only spaces or safe spaces where women would not be harassed or undermined. And so all of this led me to two competing hypotheses about gender mixing at the micro level within socially conservative communities. And particularly given the focus in public debate in these countries on men and men's behavior, how men would be likely to behave in newly mixed gender interactions in the workplace and in other areas of the public sphere. So on the left, one hypothesis, H1A, reflects the more optimistic liberal proponents of gender mixing, that men will display higher civic and political orientations when interacting with women compared to segregated or all male interactions. In general, this hypothesis has a lot going for it theoretically because of broader research on the benefits of diversity or diverse interactions across dimensions such as race and ethnicity, but also gender. For example, the contact hypothesis is one of the most prominent areas of focus in psychology. And although findings can be mixed, there is a lot of evidence that interacting with others can reduce prejudice, promote positive intergroup attitudes and behaviors. There's also research suggesting performance advantages for diverse teams and working groups. And also more focused research on the gender dimension, so how mixed gender interactions versus same gender ones can influence attitudes and behaviors in certain ways. For example, in experiments, subjects were found to contribute more to charitable causes in the presence of a female audience. Research has also shown that male CEOs pay their employees more if they have a firstborn daughter, that male legislators vote in more gender egalitarian ways if they have daughters, and that corporate boards with more women tend to be more engaged in corporate social responsibility efforts. But that said, there has been very limited work of this type on the effects of gender diverse interactions in the Middle East and in very socially conservative communities in general. And that brings me to H1B, the competing hypothesis that men will actually display lower civic and pro-social orientations when interacting with women. Now, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are arguably hard cases for theories highlighting the benefits of mixed gender interactions. And that's because these are countries where norms of patriarchy have been unusually persistent by global standards. For example, the Global Gender Gap Index, which assesses overall progress toward gender equality, ranked Saudi Arabia 127th and Kuwait 130th out of 146 countries. And we also have plenty of reason theoretically to expect mixed gender interactions under such conditions to not go necessarily that well. Indeed, social dominance theory offers a plausible alternative hypothesis, suggesting that where social hierarchies are strong and salient, higher status groups have incentives to uphold those hierarchies. And so when interacting with women, men may seek to maintain dominance rather than aspire to higher civic and pro-social standards. So in order to test these hypotheses, I conducted experiments in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And the experimental approach was selected for its many advantages, especially the use of random assignment to ensure that treatment groups would not be significantly different on important dimensions like demographics and susceptibility to social desirability bias. But a big challenge was that in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, you can't simply randomly assign men and women to a live, in-person, mixed gender interaction because of the very regulations and taboos surrounding this that I have mentioned today. So that's one reason I think why research on the dynamics of mixed gender interactions, at least experimentally, is very limited. Randomly assigning subjects to face-to-face interactions with an unrelated member of the opposite sex introduces considerable risk, legally to some extent, and also ethically for both subjects and researchers, subjects' reputations, for example. So my experiments therefore applied the principle of imagined or simulated contact, defined by Crispin Turner as the mental simulation of a social interaction with a member or members of an outgroup category. Simulated contact was initially envisioned as a kind of stopgap, where in contexts where you can't actually conduct in-person interactions across societal dimensions. But in recent years, the strategy has proven to offer some real independent value, helping to realize the benefits of contact, as Crispin Turner say, when groups are highly segregated physically or socially, or when there's little motivation to engage in that kind of contact. So in general, the experiments were designed to offer engaging yet differing contexts in which men and women might theoretically mix, with the gender of the interlocutor randomly assigned. And I used men student samples for two reasons beyond simple feasibility. First, simulated contact effects tend to be higher for younger subjects. And second, public debate in these countries often appears focused on the presumed risks of gender mixing for young people based on negative expectations about men's behavior. So one experiment was conducted in Medina with Saudi men at a large public university. Subjects first read a vivid text introduction to engage them in the scenario, kind of role-playing scenario on paper. And it was an interview for a school project. So in the treatment group, students were asked to imagine that a girl at a nearby school or university would like to interview them for their class project. And in the control group, the introduction was the same, and the interaction in general was the same, except that the interviewer's name was a man's name and male pronouns were used. Throughout the survey, questions were introduced as if either the boy or the girl were asking them in the context of a real interaction. And the scenario ended with the other student thanking the subject for the interview and leaving. And in Kuwait City, I conducted a similar experiment, but attempting to simulate a different sort of context, a professional workplace context rather than an educational context. Both education and the workplace are realms in which gender mixing has been much contested and debated. So here, this was at a large public university in Kuwait. Were invited to imagine solving a mystery, and this task was actually taken from earlier research that had been done in the U.S. on mixed rate working groups. And so they were told that they were being asked to investigate a crime robbery, and subjects read short bios of the three suspects and then were randomly assigned to work with either a woman detective or a man detective in the control group. And then afterwards, after solving the crime, the DVs were assessed, or the attitudes were assessed. And these are the attitudes that I assessed. These were based on fieldwork and consultation with in-country scholars about appropriate low-risk measures of civic and pro-social orientations. They included openness, egalitarianism, as you see here, and tolerance. These were translated into Arabic, and participation was voluntary in the context of these universities. So I know I'm kind of low on time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip to the main results. So let me show you those. So what we see here is the impact of simulated interaction with women on the men's attitudes, reported attitudes, compared to their reported attitudes in a simulated interaction with a man. And here you can see the results by country, but also pooled for the two countries. So starting with Kuwait, we do see that students assigned to the simulated interaction with a woman scored significantly higher on openness, egalitarianism, rule following, and law abidingness. Tolerance could not be measured in Kuwait because of some constraints that I can talk about, but the results for every other outcome variable indicated that simulated interaction with a woman had a positive effect on civic and pro-social attitudes. In Saudi Arabia, which featured that interview scenario, the results were obviously more limited, as you can see here, but still striking, because men tended to express more openness and also more tolerance when interacting with a woman. So despite publicly voiced concerns about gender mixing from both the conservative supporters of segregation, but also to some extent the critics of segregation who oppose segregation on principle, but still sort of expect negative behavior from men in the short term, there was considerable support for H1A and no support for the alternative hypothesis based on social dominance theory. All right, I did want to talk a little bit about, why this might be the case. So I will just quickly mention that, one possibility is stereotypes about women, and the fact that positive stereotypes about women tend to be stronger, ironically, in more gender inegalitarian contexts, and that's viewed as a situation that can be very constraining, even despite the fact that these are positive stereotypes, and it could be that these so-called benevolent sexist stereotypes drive this difference. One thing I also wanted to point out is that there was a prominent interaction here where I saw the sort of H1A, the benefits of gender diverse interactions, playing out for the somewhat religious and the not religious, but actually the opposite pattern, as you see here, for the religious. So it could very well be that certain, interpretations of religiosity can moderate these results. All right, in conclusion, the main thing that I tried to do here was look empirically into a policy domain that is much contested and very sensitive, but does not seem to have a lot of empirical research underlying it. And I think the results are, promising for contemporary efforts at desegregation that we are seeing in the region, in Saudi Arabia especially. But I do want to end on a note of caution, which is that these are simulated contact results. And so it's possible that the results would be stronger in person because the interactions would be more vivid. But real world interactions are also complex and involve a lot of different factors that might influence ultimate attitudes and behaviors. And finally, the next step in this project is to look at outcomes for women. And so that is what I hope to be moving forward with. Thank you very much. And again, sorry for those technical glitches at the start.